been working with Richard for 23 years now and still smiling. So I'm going to be talking, we couldn't have a symposium for Richard without talking about halving premature death. And you've already heard Prabhat Jha say that only 1% of the population lives in the UK. And so my talk is going to be about the other 99%. We've already heard, and you know, that evidence from high-income countries, it's now well established that the major modifiable causes of vascular mortality are blood pressure and blood lipids, adiposity and diabetes, and tobacco. But of course that seems obvious now, but it's not always been obvious, and it was really due to attention to statistical detail in the latter half of the 20th century that we really got to the right relationships. The title of my dissertation was Blood Pressure, Blood Cholesterol and Mortality, the Real Relationships. And one of the few corrections I had to make was that Rory, who was one of the examiners, and Stephen McMahon felt it was maybe a little bold and that it should be towards the real relationships. Well, I hope that we are now getting to the real relationships, at least in high-income countries. But it really is due to the attention to statistical details. And I thought, Richard, you might have heard enough about how wonderful you are today, and the audience may have heard enough, so I'm not going to say anything other than it is due to your attention to statistical detail, and if I've learned anything, I've learned the importance of that if we want to get to the real relationships, to the right relationships, we've got to avoid bias, we've got to avoid reverse causality. So I came to Oxford in 1995 to work on the prospective studies collaboration. I naively thought that would be a 3-year DPhil project, and I'd sort of waltz out of Oxford with several publications under my belt. But in 2002, we did publish, and it really was a journey from the initial findings of this collaboration that we presented to collaborators in 1996. And we had results that it was the right shape, but the presentation wasn't quite right, and Richard kept saying, well, it'll do. And again, in my naivety, I thought, it'll do. But actually what it meant was that we've got another 6 years before we get these results in a state that can be published. But boy, was it worth it, because this paper has now been cited, I think the last time I looked, over 10,000 times. It really did make a difference, the presentation of that. So we got together 61 studies, 1 million adults, 34,000 CHD deaths. So we had the big numbers, and we had enough numbers that we could remove people with prior disease. We could remove the early follow-up. And importantly, we could look age specifically. And then when we looked at that, with those 34,000 deaths, we saw these remarkably consistent straight lines, not only in old age, not only at high blood pressure, but throughout the range, with no level of blood pressure below which lower blood pressure was not associated with lower risk. And again, we've heard this statistic quoted several times today, that this is now accepted as a fact, or considered a fact, that in middle age, 20 millimeters of mercury systolic blood pressure approximately doubles the risk of vascular mortality. 5 years later, we published on cholesterol, and again, the same thing, about 2 millimoles per litre, higher total cholesterol approximately doubles the risk. BMI, and this was work done by John Dinesh and colleagues in Boston, and they decided that they wanted to get to the bottom of the obesity story, the so-called obesity paradox. Is there really no, there was publications suggesting that actually there was no increase in risk until the BMI of 30. So, having learned from Richard as a PhD student, he knew he had to get big numbers, he knew he had to avoid reverse causality, etc., etc. And so, restricted to never smokers and with no prior disease, excluding early follow-up, John collected data on BMI from around the world. He collected data on 10 million adults, 4 million of which had never smoked, 55,000 deaths. And by doing that, he showed, again, reliably, that if overweight, not obese, but if overweight, every 10 kilograms per meter squared doubles the risk. And then just finally moving on to smoking, work with Valerie Burrell on the Million Women study, or the 1.3 million women study, as it should be called, looking at vascular mortality by the amount smoked, and showing that even light smoking doubles the risk. Even smoking just 5 cigarettes a day doubles the risk of vascular mortality if you smoke consistently throughout adulthood. And so I think I've convinced you that the evidence from high-income countries is there and it's reliable. But of the 30 million premature deaths each year, 7 million of which are due to cardiovascular disease, 80% of those are in low and middle income countries. And Richard recognised this in the 1990s, and I think sort of while they wandered around global conferences and met people from these low and middle income countries who were passionate about doing epidemiology in their own country and passionate about doing big epidemiology in their own country. And so Richard worked with these people. They recognised that these large studies were needed around the world to look what's happening. That's what's happening in high income countries. What's happening around the world? And over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been lucky enough to be involved in some of these large studies that Richard has helped support, both financially and intellectually, both to get going and to successfully follow up. So there are now 5 studies, 1.5 million adults in those studies. All of them are successfully following up for mortality. On average, about 15 years follow-up in these studies. And importantly, Richard persuaded everybody that these studies are no use without a resurvey. We can't get to the real relationships unless we have a resurvey to know what is the extent of that regression dilution bias. And you've heard from you'll hear from all of these studies, and it's a real delight to know that all of the people listed on this, all except one listed on this slide, were able to come and to be here and to present today. So we needed study. We've now got studies with different exposures, different diseases all around the world. We've got 0.6 million people. Dr. Gajalakshmi's got 0.6 million, 600,000 people in India, 500,000 of those in a rural area. They're lean, very few diabetics. Dr. Shenoy in the southwest of India, in Trivandrum, has got a study of 400,000 men, both urban and rural. Professor Zaridzi, who you'll hear from, will talk about the hazardous drinking and the effects of that. We can only look at that in Russia. If we want to know what the hazardous effects of drinking are going to be in the UK, the best place to study that is in Russia. And you've already seen results from Richard's student Blake Thompson on smoking in Cuba, where many start before the age of 12, but also in Mexico, where diabetes is common and often poorly controlled. So why do we need to study in different parts of the world? Why can't we assume that what's happening in the UK, in the US, is happening all around the world? I'll just remind you of the findings from John Dinesh from the global BMI crowd, where if overweight, 10 kilograms per metre squared doubled the risk. So we thought we'd look at that in Chennai, where the mean BMI is 23 kilograms per metre squared, again with the same attention to detail, excluding early follow-up, excluding prior disease, in the non-smokers. And actually what one would expect is that, given there's evidence that at a given BMI, South Asians have lower body fat than people of European origin, that maybe this whole curve will be shifted to the left. But actually, what we found was that this appears to be little or no association between BMI and cardiac mortality in Chennai. So when we first present this finding to Richard, the first thing we have to do is to go back and check the programming was okay. The programming worked. The programming did work. And also, and we knew that because we looked at BMI versus blood pressure. So in Chennai, BMI is associated with blood pressure about the same as it is in the West. And blood pressure is associated with cardiac mortality as it is in the West. So why are we seeing no association? We think the BMI measurements, therefore, must be working. The death coding must be working. So why are we seeing no association between BMI and cardiac mortality in Chennai? And in fact, what this suggests is that at a given level of usual blood pressure, BMI is inversely related to cardiac mortality in this population. And we were talking with Dr. Gajalakshmi yesterday about plans to investigate this further. What might be causing this apparent inverse association? It can't all be confounding with socioeconomic status, because we've looked at that. It can't be smoking, because this is among the non-smokers. So what is it in this South Asian population about having a low BMI that's associated with higher risk? Sorry. Moving on to Mexico, the study was set up to look at smoking, but actually diabetes is a huge problem in Mexico, and this is a study done by Jesus Alegre and Pablo Curi in collaboration. It was set up in the 1990s with Richard and Rory, and is now run by John Emerson, who I can't see in the audience, but is here. But what they found is that diabetes is a huge problem in Mexico. And again, John, you're getting a lot of mentions here, but the Emerging Risk Factors collaboration in 2011 showed that at least in high-income countries with reasonably good glycemic control, diabetes approximately doubles overall mortality. But what about in low and middle-income countries where resources to manage that diabetes may be more limited, and particularly the vascular protective treatments, the statins, the blood pressure lowering, might be underused? So here are findings that were published in the New England Journal in 2016, diabetes and all-cause mortality. Among those, importantly, again, that attention to detail, among those without other chronic disease at baseline. And diabetes is a huge problem in Mexico. At age 60, approximately 20% of men and women will have diabetes. How does that translate into risk? Well, again, the findings were striking. 5-fold risk among people in early middle age who had diabetes, 5 times more likely to die than those who don't have diabetes. And so this translates into about a third of all deaths in Mexico, all premature deaths in Mexico due to diabetes. And an important finding here, similar for men and women. So again, unlike in the high-income countries, not only does diabetes seem to be more likely to kill you, it seems to do so equally among men and women. So can we halve premature mortality? I think we can, but it will require lifestyle changes and the prolific use of cost-effective generics, in particular the statins and the blood pressure lowering. But we need to continue to do these large studies in different countries if we're really going to understand not only the current, but also the future effects of these major causes of death in low and middle income countries. And you heard from Tom Frieden earlier how he and his colleagues are using the data that have been produced from these large epidemiological studies to inform both their global burden of for Alan, the global burden of disease estimates, and for the global hearts, for their policy, for their policies and their technical packages. Thank you.